What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So with Superior Iron Man really wrapped up, what I wanted to do is fill the next couple weeks or so with just some miscellaneous stories that I've kind of been kicking around, stories that I thought would be pretty fun to cover. And I want to pick up with something called Schism. Now, Schism is basically like this X-Men Civil War, right? Like back in 2011, it was this idea of creating this rift in the X-Men community where you had the Wolverine side and you had the Cyclops side, and the two of them actually end up fighting. But it's really kind of cool because one of the things that Marvel was looking at really in the post House of M era was ways to basically kind of rework and create new interest in the X-Men franchise. Back in 2004, during the events of House of M, and really a lot of this stems all the way back to like Project Wide Awake back in the 80s and the early 90s, Marvel was looking at the idea of basically reducing the mutant population. What they ended up doing was they had the Scarlet Witch sort of go crazy, strip 98% of the mutant population of their powers, and so instead of there being millions of mutants, now there were only 198. Now, the cool thing about this is because of the fact that the mutant population had been reduced down to such a small number, what it did is it allowed Marvel to tell more concise and more character-driven stories about the X-Men, really in terms of the individual characters themselves, and take them in new directions. Specifically, emphasis was put on Cyclops. Now, the reason why I say that is because this story really marks like the beginning of Marvel turning Cyclops into not really a villain so much as an anti-hero, but at the very least, moving him away from like the Boy Scout role that he played in Marvel for so long, because Cyclops was always like the #1 guy of Charles Xavier, and he was the one guy who always believed in his dream and the one guy who would always do whatever it took to make it happen. This does come out of a couple things. One of the biggest things it comes out of is Second Coming. Remember, when it came to the idea of House of M, the idea that mutants had been reduced down to 198, there was a story called Messiah Complex, and that dealt with the birth of Hope Summers, really this character who's almost completely irrelevant now, but at the time, she was the first mutant born after the events of House of M. And Marvel said, okay, if we're gonna have mutants start coming back, it's gonna be a much slower and a far more gradual process as opposed to just mutants popping up everywhere. And so what this ended up doing is it led to Marvel introducing something called the 5 Lights. And the 5 Lights were basically just 5 mutants, basically the 5 mutants who were born after the events of House of M after Hope Summers. Now in truth, it was really Hope's like own little team. It was just Generation Hope is really all it was. But the reason why this is important is because with the birth of Hope Summers, there was this mad dash of people to basically get their hands on her. Not only that, there was also a guy by the name of Bastion. Now Bastion is kind of this weird scenario. He's basically like a combination of Nimrod and Master Mold. Now Nimrod is basically a sentinel from the days of future past who traveled back in time to try to kill the X-Men, that kind of a thing. But the idea is that Master Mold was literally this giant machine that cranked out sentinels. What ended up happening is Master Mold and Nimrod merged into a singular being named Bastion. Now Bastion had things like Operation Zero Tolerance and so on and so forth, but the overall gist is that he had always been an enemy of the X-Men. Eventually, during the events of Second Coming, he had launched like wave after wave after wave against the X-Men. This combined with like the Purifiers, this crazy religious zealotry group that was led by William Stryker, basically resulted in like the destruction of the Xavier Institute. At the same time, the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, had seized control of S.H.I.E.L.D. He'd taken over the United States. The X-Men basically bailed out. They moved from Westchester all the way out to Utopia, which is an island off the coast of San Francisco. There were a lot of things that were going on in the midst of this story being told, or at least things that led up to the story. Again, I think it'd be kind of cool to cover that stuff, but I don't really know if people have an interest in it. But at the very least, the reason why this matters is because, again, the X-Men are at a point where they're beginning to be accepted to a degree. Now, the other half of this is that because of the fact that Cyclops had intervened during the whole attempt by Bastion to launch these, huge Sentinel programs and so on and so forth, and because the X-Men were the ones that had basically saved the world, what ended up happening is the President of the United States actually awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Cyclops. In response to this, Captain America basically said, it's time for you guys to come out to the world. It's time for you guys to say, hey, look, we want to be on a much grander stage. The reason why this is cool is because it leads to Cyclops and Wolverine directly traveling to the United Nations with a request that all these different countries begin dismantling their Sentinel program. Now, this is a pretty big deal because remember, when it came to the mutant population, because there were so many of them before House of M, they were scattered everywhere. I mean, there were mutants all over the place. You had all these different types of mutants out there in the world, their allegiances were questionable, sometimes their allegiances were absolute, but humanity didn't quite know how to deal with them because there were so many of them. But with the population being reduced down to 198, this is the equivalent of like a cornered fox, right? Like a fox is most dangerous when it's cornered. Humanity views the X-Men, views mutants the same way. Because there's so few of them, they're more dangerous now than they were before because they're so consolidated into a singular location. Now, the other half of this is, remember, that when it comes to Marvel Comics, mutants are by and large the most powerful group. Marvel can say what they want to about the Inhumans. The mutants are the most powerful. You have mutants that range everywhere, from people with super strength and agility all the way up to people who can warp reality on a universal scale. So you have all manner of extremely powerful characters. And so because of this, humanity began to panic. But with Cyclops stepping up and saying, we are not enemies, we are here to be friends, this is basically him trying to assuage humanity and assure them that they are basically good guys. The problem with this is that in the middle of this pledge, with him trying to talk to, the United Nations, Quentin Quire ends up showing up. Now, Quentin Quire was a character who had really gained his claim to fame under Grant Morrison, where he basically launched a revolution against, Professor X in the Xavier Institute. But there were basically casualties in his revolution. The result is that Quentin Quire was basically taken under control, but as his character progressed, because he was so powerful in the sense that he's an Omega level telepath, Marvel didn't really know what to do with his character. So eventually they just sort of wrote him out of the story, or wrote him out of the landscape, in the sense that he evolved to a higher state of entropy and basically reached a non-corporeal form where he was just a form of energy, and then he was just bottled, and that was really it. The crazy thing about this is that with him showing up, one of the big ideas of Quentin Quire under Grant Morrison's run of New X-Men is that he wholeheartedly believed that Magneto was right, that Magneto was the right guy, that at the end of the day, it was all about the idea of basically forcing humanity to accept mutants or enslaving humanity. That was basically the way it was. And so in response to this, Quentin Quire basically says humans are not these perfect beings. And for them to sit in judgment of mutant kind and say, oh man, look at these mutants, these bad guys, it really puts them in a sour spot. It runs right through him. So what he ends up doing is basically using his telepathy to initiate this kind of uncontrollable urge by all these humans at the United Nations to start pouring out their deepest, darkest secrets. And it's crazy because at the end of the day, we end up finding out that where the X-Men are shunned and people are just like, oh man, the X-Men are dangerous, these normal humans, these members of the United Nations, are doing things like fixing elections, cheating on their wives, engaging in extortion, money laundering, slave trading, all these crazy different things. And so of course, this eventually leads to the question of, will anybody actually believe it? But before they end up getting into all that, what we end up finding out is that because the X-Men were arriving here, at the very least Cyclops and Wolverine, humanity was prepared. What they ended up doing is they ended up stockpiling Sentinels, so that if things popped off, the Sentinels would basically respawn. Now, when it comes to Marvel Comics, Sentinels have been depicted in different ways. In truth, the worst sort of scenario with Sentinels was depicted in like Days of Future Past, right? Like where Sentinels had basically self-replicating each other, and they had evolved to the point where they could counter mutant abilities to a degree. And so of course, this brings into question, why would humanity have weapons at a peace conference? But regardless of the scenario, Quentin Quire ends up jumping on camera and basically saying, watch what happens. Watch how these people will basically go through and just start making up lies and reasons for why it is they said the things they did. Because of this is really Quentin Quire saying, hey, look, no matter what happens here, they're all going to make up lies. And to a degree, it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you're a normal person sitting at home and you hear about the dangerous mutants, well, then suddenly it's very easy for someone who is manipulated by Quentin Quire to come around and say, well, I didn't say anything true. That telepath made me say those things. And then suddenly they have an out. This also leads to the introduction of a kid by the name of Cade Kilgore. Now, Cade Kilgore is probably one of my absolute favorite villains in Marvel Comics because he's like a little kid with no powers. He's just absolutely genius. And the crazy thing about this is that his father is a weapons manufacturer, not on the same level as Tony Stark. It's really more like firearms and different things like that. But because of the panic that's going on with this whole scenario with the UN being broadcast across the world, people are literally just stockpiling firearms everywhere they go. And for the most part, they're buying Kilgore firearms. Well, because of this, the stock value of the company is just skyrocketing into the air, so on and so forth. But we end up finding out that what Cade had actually done is blackmail the board of directors of Kilgore Industries, whatever it's called, into making Cade the CEO. And then in turn, Cade shoots his father and dumps him in the mountains. It's pretty extreme. It's pretty crazy, but that's what this kid is. Like, that's the basis behind him. He's just that dark and he's just that cruel, but he's also that genius because what he says is he's been planning this for 2 years. He's literally spent the last 2 years just going through and planning all these things in order to solidify himself as one of the most capable people still out there. Now, the other half of this is a character by the name of Edie, and actually she'll be one of the central points of this story. At least I think it's pronounced Edie. It might be Edie, I'm not 100% sure, but the idea is that she was actually a character that hailed from Nigeria, and she has the ability to manipulate temperature. She's not like Iceman. Edie is more like Pyro. Pyro can manipulate fire, but Pyro cannot create fire. With Edie, it's the exact same way. If she's sitting in a room that's extremely cold, she can't adjust the temperature of that room unless she has heat to draw on from some external source, like an outside hallway or something along those lines. It's really one of those ambiguous kind of powers that Marvel just uses for circumstance, but she's going to play a very central role in this story, which is something that I want you to keep your eyes on. But the other thing about this is that because of everything that had gone on with Quentin Quire, instead of humanity standing down on their Sentinel program, instead, they're actually doubling up. What they end up doing is they actually end up relaunching all these Sentinels that hadn't been seen for quite some time, under the idea that they're trying to keep their country safe. And so because of this, what we end up finding out is that Cade Kilgore, by virtue of his actions toppling his father's company, orchestrating this whole scenario with Quentin Quire by basically releasing him, and then gambling on the idea that Quentin Quire would in turn show up at the United Nations and try to broadcast some message tantamount to what Magneto would have done, that Cade Kilgore has been inducted into the Hellfire Club. Now, in Marvel Comics, the Hellfire Club is actually a pretty cool organization. They are basically a group that exists behind the scenes. They serve the purpose of influencing governments, different things like that. The Hellfire Club originally had people like Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost and so on and so forth, but it was largely people with powers. The implication that's being given here is the Hellfire Club wasn't always that way. Instead, the Hellfire Club was just the most influential people in the world coming together to control things behind the scenes, not really for world domination, just to make sure that things kind of ran according to their whims and wants, while the governments of the world still remain intact, the corporations still remain intact, that kind of a thing. But what seems to be indicated here is that the arrival of Sebastian Shaw, the arrival of Emma Frost, these characters taking up the roles of the Black King and the White Queen respectively, was basically these people with powers, mutants, effectively co-opting the Hellfire Club. And so this, as far as the Hellfire Club is concerned, is a return to the way things are supposed to be. The other half of this is that because a lot of these Sentinels that are being used by these, various governmental organizations, because they're so old, as soon as they start to fire them up, they immediately start falling apart. They immediately start breaking down and going to pieces all over the place. Now, because of the fact of what Quentin Quire did, because he legitimately believed that he was right, what he ends up doing is actually taking up residence with the X-Men. He shows up at Utopia and requests asylum. And this is where the rift begins to form between Cyclops and between Wolverine. Now, it's essentially the ideology of Cyclops versus the ideology of Wolverine. Remember, Wolverine has been both an Avenger and the X-Men, and his loyalties for the most part are to the X-Men. I mean, he really follows Cyclops because in a lot of ways, he agrees with Cyclops as he's trying to carry out Xavier's continued dream of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, with Xavier currently being absent from the X-Men. But Cyclops' whole persona, or his whole belief system, is rooted around the idea that because there's so few mutants left, even if Quentin Quire is the most wanted fugitive in the world, it's the responsibility of the X-Men to hold him accountable for what he did and to put him on trial. It's not the responsibility of the rest of the world, because in the eyes of Cyclops, if Quentin Quire were to go on trial in front of the rest of the world, he would immediately be convicted, because it's literally humanity trying a mutant. What hope could he possibly have? At the same time, the X-Men are basically trying to avoid a conflict with the Avengers, because when Captain America calls up and says, hey man, things are crazy out here, do you guys have any idea what's going on with Quentin Quire? If Cyclops were to speak up and say, yeah, he's right over there, Captain America would immediately demand that Quentin Quire be handed over. If the X-Men said no, it would lead to a conflict. And so it's really just Cyclops trying to figure out the best situation. Now, of course, this also comes into the idea of the Stepford Cuckoos basically chiming in and saying, hey, these characters are here, these characters are over there, we're responding to these different emergencies, so on and so forth. Now, the Stepford Cuckoos are basically cloned versions of Emma Frost, is really what it was. Because Emma Frost is one of the most powerful telepaths in the world, the Weapon X project tried to duplicate her abilities by cloning her. The difference between the Stepford Cuckoos and Emma Frost is that Emma Frost is extremely powerful on her own. And while the Stepford Cuckoos are capable individually, they're actually better when they share a hive mind, when the three of them all work together. The idea is that with the Stepford Cuckoos working together, the three of them are almost as powerful as Emma Frost. But the idea here is that with this disagreement between Wolverine and Cyclops, Wolverine just kind of takes off to a bar to drink alcohol. Now, the other half of this is that within San Francisco, the mayor is actually launching the opening of a museum of mutant history. Now, the reason for this is because, again, because of the fact that the X-Men have helped to save off various attacks against San Francisco, they actually gained the support of the population. This is designed by the mayor to basically show solace to to say, hey, look, some of us know what you're about and some of us appreciate what you do. And the problem with this is that when Cyclops sends an X-Men team out there to basically, participate in the opening of this mutant history, it's more of a show of force as opposed to basically saying, hey, look, we're here to support the actions of the mayor, because the people Cyclops sends are like Magneto, Iceman, Namor the Submariner, Colossus, and Emma Frost. These are powerhouses. These are folks who if things pop off, they'll quell whatever threat it is that shows up. And that's really what Cyclops was looking to say, hey, look, we got 5 guys here, and 5 people is all we need to hold down a city. The problem with this is that Cyclops is not accounting for Cade Kilgore. And that's why Kilgore is such a cool character, is because he thinks 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. And his mind, as soon as this, museum of mutant history was opened up, and as soon as word reached his ears that the X-Men were going to respond, he immediately knew who it was that Cyclops was going to send. Cyclops was going to send his most powerful guys. And so Cade Kilgore had actually arranged, alongside other children who basically killed off their own parents and usurped their companies, and launched an attack against the X-Men for the purpose of 1, blocking the telepathy of Emma Frost, and 2, incapacitating these X-Men that Cyclops sent. And so all that's really left is whatever X-Men managed to make their way over there, which is really just Edie, and then Wolverine, who's out at a bar watching everything pop off. And so as soon as things begin to go awry, the only 2 people who were there that can actually do anything are Wolverine, who's on his way, and Edie, who's watching everything unfold. Because of this, with Cyclops arriving on the scene and do what he can to cope with the situation, as well as Wolverine showing up, what we end up having is this conversation where Edie is watching everything unfold. Edie's question is, what should I do? And this is what creates the rift. The idea of Cyclops is, do whatever you have to do to save the lives of our fellow X-Men. The idea of Wolverine is, she's a kid. She has no business engaging in conflict like this. But Edie ends up siding with Cyclops, uses her powers, neutralizes the member of the Hellfire Club, manages to get some of the X-Men out. The civilians are largely saved, but the members of the Hellfire Club were all killed in the explosion of the bomb. Now, the biggest reason why this is important is because in the aftermath of this explosion is actually a secondary detonation. The difference is that this secondary detonation manipulates magnetism, and it's designed for the purpose of literally being a program in and of itself, in the sense that it reaches out and it grabs any and all forms of inert metal, and then it literally just forms into a giant sentinel. Now, of course, this Sentinel just serves a purpose of trying to get to Utopia and then destroy the mutants, and that's really about it. But the biggest emphasis here is the fight between Cyclops and the fight between Wolverine. Because the idea here is that for Wolverine himself, Cyclops doesn't know what he's talking about. Cyclops is a guy playing soldier, but Cyclops has never really fought in the fires of war. Like, he's never been in a wartime conflict. He's fought a few characters here and there. He's fought some bad guys. He's fought some Sentinels. But when you're Wolverine, you fought in the Civil War. He fought during World War I. He fought during World War II, he fought during the Vietnam. He fought through all these different conflicts. He's seen so many people lose their lives, and he's seen child soldiers. And so because of this, when Cyclops begins saying, these kids here are not kids, they're X-Men, and they need to be X-Men, in the mind of Wolverine, Cyclops is allying himself with the idea of using child soldiers. And for Wolverine, this is intolerable. And so what he actually does is he laces the place with 2,000 pounds of explosives, tells everybody to evacuate Utopia, and then it just boils down to a fight between himself and Cyclops. Now, this is cool because these guys, they're fighting for keeps. These guys are out for blood. And it's kind of a cool scenario because remember, Wolverine, the adamantium in his body, that's true adamantium. You can't like superheat it to the point where it ends up just melting. It doesn't work that way. Once it hardens, it's hardened for good. So in truth, Cyclops is fighting a losing battle because remember, with his optic blasts, they're not heat. They are basically concussion blasts. Being hit with the optic beams of Cyclops is like being punched insanely hard. It's not really overheating you, it's just hitting you with a massive amount of energy at an extremely fast pace. And so because of this, it's literally like trying to take out Wolverine's adamantium with like a chisel. It's not gonna work. But notice this, I mean, these guys are bloody, these guys are bruised, Wolverine's missing half of his face. It's pretty intense how far these guys are going. Now, of course, once the Sentinel arrives on the scene, it takes the combined efforts of all the X-Men to basically destroy it, and that's really about it. The whole Sentinel gets destroyed. Cade Kilgore and company basically just kind of bail out. They watch the events unfold, and they seem to go completely unscathed. But the importance of this is that this leaves Cyclops and it leaves Wolverine with a bad taste towards one another. At the end of the day, Wolverine has this conversation with Edie where she basically says, well, yeah, I mean, a bunch of those Hellfire guys died, but I don't really feel bad about it because it's just par for the course with being an X-Men. But the fact that she would give this answer, the fact that she would say, well, the X-Men are really more of like a militaristic force as opposed to a peacekeeping force means that the X-Men have failed, that the dream of Charles Xavier is gone, that Cyclops is basically weaponized the X-Men. Those kids who are growing up in Utopia, they're looking at this and basically saying, yeah, like we're like an army. And so in the eyes of Wolverine, Cyclops has lost his way. Cyclops is no longer a leader of the X-Men. Cyclops is no longer a guy who can effectively be someone that leads the team proper. And so what Wolverine ends up doing is basically breaking off. He forms his own X-Men team. And actually what he does is he goes back to the remains of the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters with the intention of rebuilding it and setting his own school up after that. But this is basically the rift. This is where things like Regenesis come into play. This is where, if any of you guys have been reading X-Men within the last maybe 6 or 7 years, this is where you run into the scenario of there being like a Cyclops school and a Wolverine school. This is why that happened, is because of the events of Schism and the fact that there are irreconcilable differences between Wolverine and Cyclops. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Oh, the cool thing about this too, something else, is that because of the fact that there are 2 different schools, Marvel launched 2 different titles. What they ended up doing is they created this story called Regenesis, which is just a one-shot, and it's basically the aftermath of Schism. And then Wolverine's team is followed in Wolverine and the X-Men, and then of course Cyclops' team is followed in Uncanny X-Men. They actually relaunch Uncanny X-Men with issue number 1, which is kind of cool. But anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.